Okay, so once your work has dried to a leather hard stage, meaning it's lost most of the moisture and it's lost most of the flexibility, but I can still fairly easily trim and carve out of the surface. But it's not sticky anymore. If you rub your hands over the surface, nothing comes off on your fingertips. Okay? If it feels kind of chalky, then you might have let it dry a little too much. You might want to spray it down really well and just wrap it up for 5 minutes. Okay? One of the hard things for beginners about bowls is managing the drying. And a lot of times you'll allow the top to dry out a little bit too much, and that can be problematic because it might crack when you're doing things on the wheel. Generally what I do is I'll leave my piece out for a few hours. So if you're in class and you throw the piece in the morning, you could leave it open for the rest of the day. Then come back at the end of the school day. And what I try to do is I try to wrap my plastic up so that it's just sitting on the surface and the bottom is still open. Because what I want is to force the air down to the bottom to dry out the bottom. If you leave a bowl sit out in the classroom, the top generally dries first because it's the thinnest area, and then the bottom, where it's nice and thick, usually dries out slower. So when I came back in and flipped these over upside down, or when I came back in this morning and I checked them, the top was pretty dry, but the bottom was actually still a little wet. So I had to flip it upside down. I had to cover up the outside here with plastic so just the top would dry. So it takes a little bit of management skill in getting these to where they need to be. Okay? If you need to spray them down with water, you can. In an extreme case, you could run them under the sink to rehydrate them and wrap them up for 5 minutes. Okay? Again, from the last video, it's super important to make sure that your rim is perfectly level. If it's not, when you flip your bowl over and center it, your bowl's actually going to sit a little bit crooked, and you'll end up trimming a crooked foot. It just kind of looks a little funky. So you want to make sure your rims are always nice and level. Okay? The other thing that I do is before I do a trim, I take one more mental note in my brain and I look at the inside curve so I know what the profile on the inside looks like. And I also take a look at the thickness of the walls down at the bottom. So in this particular piece, I'm not going to do any trimming probably lower than that on my bowl. All my trimming is going to happen right there between my fingertips. The other mental note I'm taking is how thick is my floor. I left my floor a little bit thicker than I normally do for the cylinders, so I can trim a little bit out of the inside in here and make that raised foot. This is a good example of a finished bowl's foot. Alright, so this bowl, much like the one I'm about to trim, started off with a bottom that was a little bit too wide, it was too thick, and then using your trimming tools, in your buckets you should have these two. You'll get rid of some of that excess clay on the outside and on the inside of where you want your foot to be. Now if the bottom is too thin, you don't have to trim this. You can leave this be flat, but it has to be cleaned up and ribbed. So this is a good finished foot. It has a good angle change, helps catch glaze, and it keeps the piece off the surface of the table. In your bucket you should have these two tools. You've got more of a round one and a flatter one. Up in the cabinet with the hand building supplies, I've also got some trimming tools that are a little smaller. These are a good one to use as well. I'll do some of my demos with the big ones though, since that's what most of you have in your buckets. You will need to have a little bit of clay from the plaster table to hold this down in place. I like my clay to be a little bit on the drier side so that it's not sticky anymore. This will help hold my bowl down really well without it coming off the wheel top. Okay? It's very important that when you flip this upside down and you secure it to your wheel, it has to be perfectly center. So if your bowl is spinning and you can see a wobble back and forth in the rim or in the foot or both, it's not centered. I do my trimming on the wheel head. I don't trim on a bat because I like to be able to use the rings on the wheel head to help me center. So I'm going to just put the rim of my bowl right in between this first set of rings here that I can see and try to have an even space all the way around. And now as I spin, let's see how close that is to centered. That's pretty close. I've got one little spot here where it's a little bit closer to the ring, so I shifted away from that just a hair in this case. And that's pretty centered. Okay. Sometimes as a beginner, your piece, your bowl isn't totally symmetrical, so you might have a wobble regardless. If that's the case, I would always try to get the trimming area as centered as possible. So a little trick for that is you could take your needle tool, and if you can tell there's a little wobble but you're not really sure where it is, take your needle tool and slowly get as close to that clay as you can until you start touching the part that's closest to you. So here's my mark. This is the part that was closest to me. And I'm going to push it away from that mark. So I'm going to go that way just a tiny little bit, about a quarter of an inch maybe. And then I can wipe that mark clean. And I'll do that again. Get my needle tool as close as I can get it until it starts to touch. Here's my mark, so I'm going to go maybe another, this time I might just go a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch, not very much. Wipe that mark away. And then what you want is for you to be able to get right up to the surface of the clay without it bouncing back and forth against your needle. So that's pretty close. Okay, for a bowl this size, I use about 4 lugs of clay is kind of the term that's used in the ceramic world. And roll them out into slightly thick coils. You don't want them to be too narrow, too thin. You want them to be a little bit on the thicker side. I'm going to hold my bowl down and I'm going to push these coils down into the wheel and stick them into the wheel on the edge of my bowl. When I do this one, I'm going to flip and do the other side across the diameter. Again, I'm holding my bowl down so it doesn't move while I'm doing that. Sometimes beginners forget to hold their bowl, and as they're pushing this down, the bowl shifts, and now it's not centered again. Definitely shouldn't use 3 of these unless you had a really small piece. Then maybe 3 would work. You should use 4 or 5. You don't really need more than 5 for a bowl this size. Okay, so now thinking back to my mental note that I took, I know that most of my trimming is going to happen right in here, and I have to think about how wide do I want to make my foot. So if I've got my finished bowl here, how wide do I want that foot to be? I want it to be well balanced, but I also want that foot to be nice and far underneath the piece so that I can get rid of as much weight as possible. So I take my needle and I just draw, this first line is where the outside of my foot is going to be. This second line is where the inside of my foot is going to be. So I'm going to be trimming all of this stuff away, and I'm going to be trimming what's on the inside of those lines away. In order to trim, you're going to hold your, whether you're righty or lefty, doesn't matter, hold it like a pencil, okay? Or sometimes you can change your grip like this, but that doesn't work as well for trimming. A pencil grip works a little bit better. And you're going to brace both hands together so that they're nice and steady. Bring the tool at a 45-degree angle and just rest it on the surface of the clay, and you'll pretty quickly start taking off a tiny little bit of clay. And then I want you to push down a little harder until you start getting this size of trimming. That's a good size, okay? Now if your bowl is leather hard and the right consistency, these trimmings should stay together. If your bowl is too dry, these trimmings will be like little shavings. It won't be a big long string of clay like this. They'll be little shavings, or sometimes they'll break off into little pieces like this. If your bowl's too wet, they don't fall off the side of the piece. So as I'm trimming, you'll see these pieces just fall off the side of the bowl. If it's too wet, they get stuck to the side of the bowl, and then they get stuck in your trimming. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get rid of all of this extra clay right here. A little bit of pressure. And once I get down to my line, my first line, now I'm going to start moving my trimming tool down the side of the piece to remove some clay down here. And I know that it's a little thinner here, so I'm going to start just releasing my pressure a little bit and not taking off so much. Okay? And down here it's actually a little bit drier, so you can tell. You see how this is scraping? You might hear that noise if your work is too dry. My rim is pretty dry here, but I'm not trimming it, so I'm not too worried about it. But down here, this is perfect. Okay? Now, in order to make your foot, you probably want to use the narrow end of your trimming tool, and you're just going to trim straight down. So I did switch up my grip here because I can't really use a pencil grip, and I'm a lefty, so I hold it in my left hand, but I'm still always trimming at 3 o'clock. Whether you're lefty or righty, you should be trimming at roughly 3 o'clock. And I'm trying to make this profile of my bowl come into the foot and then change angles. And then once I do that, I can go, and again, in my mental picture, I know what the inside of my bowl looks like, and I'm trying to match that on the outside. So now I'm going to do the inside. For the inside, I didn't have a lot of clay. I think my floor is probably a little over maybe a ½ inch, not quite. So I'm just going to trim a little bit out. And for this one, you might use your tool a little sideways and use the sharp end of it. I start in the middle and I trim my way out. Some people start on the outside and trim their way in. And I don't go past that line that I made for myself. Okay? So now that I know in my brain I'm getting kind of thin in my floor, so what I do is I push down just slightly to see if this starts caving in. Okay? Now if my work is leather hard, I can push down on it and it should still be flexible. If it moves really easy, I definitely went too far. If it has a tiny little give, I'm probably just about there. So I'm going to do one more little trim. I think that's perfect. It's just starting to move a little bit, so I can clean it up. And I'm going to use the side. This side angle here works good for cleaning up your trimming marks. What we don't want to leave is all of these sloppy marks on the side of your piece like this. Okay, once you've trimmed, if you've got those, you should go back over with a straighter edge. This one would work good on a bowl to clean those marks up. Just like that. Right, now I'm going to try to make a little better angle here in the foot. I think I can go a little further down out here on the outside. Now, this is a beginner mistake that happens. Sometimes you just keep on trimming and you keep on trimming and eventually you trim through the side of your piece. I hope that nobody does that. You have to be always thinking about how much clay you've got left so that doesn't happen. That's always a bummer when you've got this really nice piece and then you end up trimming through it. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. My last step here in the trimming is I want to make sure my foot is nice and round. It doesn't have to be a total perfectly round all the way. I usually just trim off a little bit of the corner and then a little bit of the other corner. So it's just rounded. It's not perfectly round. All right, then my next step is going to be to go back in, take a sponge that's slightly damp, and your metal or your rubber rib would work really well for this. And I'm going to smooth out all those lines. So I just get it a little bit wet. And clean up all my trimming marks. This is also something you want to make sure you're going to do if you're going to put underglaze on or you're going to do a slip texture or a design. You want to make sure that your bottom's nice and smooth. If I've got a rubber rib, I could use a rubber rib, but I don't know where mine is at the moment. I usually prefer the rubber ones for this because the metal ones are a little bit too aggressive. Rubber ones are a little softer. And then this part here, I want to make sure, this is what's going to touch a tabletop. So I want to make sure this is perfectly smooth. Again, better with the rubber rib. But I can do it with the metal one too. It's nice and round. I even use my fingernail for this sometimes. I just round this with my fingernail. And I make sure that it's smooth on the corners. And then I'm going to sign my name. Remember, don't sign your name with a needle tool. That's never a good idea. Dull pencil works fine. This works fine. Something that's not going to cut or pierce. Okay? Take your lugs off the bottom. Make sure that you clean up any leftover debris on the surface. And then I would let this dry upside down, because you can see in the change in the color that my rim is pretty dry, but this is still a little bit soft down here. So let this dry upside down on your shelf.